The steak lodged in Isabella's throat on a Tuesday evening in November. In a restaurant George Hartwell would never have chosen if his assistant hadn't made the reservation. The place had vinyl booths and paper placemats. The kind of small-town Montana establishment that smelled like coffee and years of fried food. George had been scrolling through quarterly reports on his phone when his 8-year-old daughter started, making sounds that weren't quite words. He looked up. Isabella's face had gone red, her eyes wide with panic. Her small hands clutched at her throat. George's phone clattered to the table. He knew the Heimlich maneuver. In theory, he'd taken a mandatory CPR class years ago for some corporate liability reason, but his hands wouldn't move. Time fractured into individual seconds, each one stretching impossibly long. His daughter was choking. His daughter was dying. And he was frozen. Someone moved past him in a blur of motion. The waitress, their waitress. He realized distantly, pushed the table aside with one hip. The candle flame beside Isabella's plate flickered wildly. The woman's hands, small but strong, positioned themselves just below Isabella's ribcage. One sharp compression. 2, 3. Something dark flew from Isabella's mouth and hit the floor. His daughter gasped. A horrible rattling sound. Then started crying. George lunged forward and caught her as she fell into his arms. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold her. "You're safe," he whispered into her hair. "You're safe, sweetheart, you're safe." The waitress had stepped back, was calmly moving the candle to a safer position. She brought a glass of water, set it on the table. George noticed everything about her in that heightened moment, the name tag that read Carrie. The calluses on her hands that had just saved his daughter's life. The weariness beneath her professional smile. "Take small sips," Carrie said to Isabella, her voice gentle. "Just breathe for a minute." "Thank you." George's voice cracked. I didn't. "It happens fast," Carrie said. "She's okay now. That's what matters." She picked up the piece of meat from the floor with a napkin. Brought Isabella a glass of milk instead of water. Checked that the girl was breathing normally. Then she quietly cleared their plates and disappeared toward the kitchen. The whole thing had taken maybe 90 seconds. George held Isabella until she stopped crying. Other diners had returned to their meals. The cook had come out to check on them. Assured George there would be no charge for dinner. Someone brought Isabella a dish of ice cream. But George couldn't stop shaking. He'd almost lost her. In the time it took to read an email. He'd almost lost his daughter. The only family he had left. When they left an hour later. Isabella's hand tightened his. She whispered, "I like that lady. Daddy." George looked back. Carrie was serving another table, smiling at an elderly couple. But he could see the exhaustion in the way she moved. She glanced at the clock on the wall, and something anxious flickered across her face. He realized he didn't know anything about her except that she'd saved his daughter's life, and he could never repay her. That night in his hotel room, while Isabella slept in the adjoining suite, George stood at the window and looked out at the small town below. A few streetlights, a church steeple, mountains dark against the stars. He'd been traveling for 3 years, dragging his daughter from city to city for business, staying in hotels that all looked the same. His hands had finally stopped shaking, but something else had started, a feeling he couldn't name. Not just gratitude, something deeper. A recognition of how close to the edge they'd been living. George returned to the restaurant 2 days later with an envelope in his jacket pocket. Inside was $5,000 in cash. It seemed both inadequate and wildly generous. But he didn't know what else to do. Carrie was working the lunch shift. She saw him come in, and something careful entered her expression. She seated them at the same booth. Brought Isabella orange juice without being asked. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" she asked Isabella. "Good. Daddy says we came to see you." Carrie's eyes lifted to George's face. He waited until Isabella was coloring on her placemat with crayons Carrie had provided. Then he slid the envelope across the table. "I wanted to thank you properly," he said, "for what you did." Carrie looked at the envelope but didn't touch it. After a moment, She slid it back toward him. I can't accept this, Mr. Hartwell. George blinked. I'm sorry. I appreciate the thought. But I was just doing my job. Your job is to serve food, not to save lives. I have first aid training. Her voice was gentle but absolute. Any waitress would have done the same thing. I'm just glad Isabella's okay. George stared at her. Everyone had a price. He'd learned that building his hotel empire. Everyone wanted something. Then let me offer you a job, he said. I own 17 hotels across 6 states. I can start you in management, excellent salary, full benefits, relocation assistance. You'd be making 3 times what you make here. For a moment, something flickered in Carrie's eyes, interest, maybe, or longing. Then she shook her head. I can't leave this town, Mr. Hartwell. But thank you. Really. I'm just glad Isabella's safe. That's enough. She refilled his coffee and moved to another table before he could respond. Isabella looked up from her coloring. Why can't the pretty lady come with us? Daddy. She has her own life here. Sweetheart, but you could give her a better one. You always say you can fix things. George watched Carrie work through the lunch rush. She was competent and kind with every customer, never rushed despite being obviously understaffed. But he kept seeing her glance at the wall clock, her shoulders tightening each time. She was working against something, racing against time he couldn't see. He left a $100 tip under his coffee cup. When he looked back from the parking lot, he saw Carrie pick it up and immediately hand it to the cook. She'd refused that too. That night, Isabella asked, Can we see her again before we leave? George thought about the woman who'd refused $5,000 and a dream job, who'd saved his daughter without expecting anything in return, who seemed to be carrying the weight of something too heavy for her narrow shoulders. Maybe, he said. But what he was really thinking was, what kind of person turns down that much help when they clearly need? Yet the question kept him awake, just before dawn. He realized it wasn't frustration he felt. It was curiosity, and underneath that, something else. Something that felt almost like hope. George made phone calls. He was good at research, at finding information, at solving puzzles. The owner of the diner knew someone who knew someone. Small towns were like that. Information flowed through coffee shops and church basements. The story came together in pieces. Carrie Mitchell, 24 years old. Parents killed in a car accident 18 months ago on a winter road. Left behind 4 kids, Carrie, Jake, who was 16 now, Riley, who was 13, and Tommy, who was 9. Carrie had dropped out of college to become their guardian. She worked 3 jobs: the restaurant, early morning shifts at the bakery, weekend cleaning at the church and the clinic. The reason she was racing against time if she couldn't demonstrate stable income and adequate housing by the end of the year. Social services would place the kids in foster care. No single family could take all 3 siblings, so they'd be separated. Different homes, different schools. The family would shatter into pieces. George sat in his hotel room with this information and felt something crack open in his chest. He'd been running for 3 years, running from Eleanor's death, from the empty house where her things still hung in the closet, from the weight of being a single parent who didn't know how to parent. He'd buried himself in work, dragged Isabella from city to city, hired nannies who never stayed more than a few months. He'd told himself he was building something for her, securing her future. But what he'd really been doing was hiding, from grief, from responsibility, from the terrifying vulnerability of being needed. His business partner Tom called that evening to discuss the Montana property deal. At the end, Tom said, "When are you going to stop running? George, that girl needs a mother, and you need to come back to life." George ended the call and stood at the window. 17 floors below, the city spread out in a grid of lights, each one a separate life, burning alone in the darkness. He'd been one of those lights for 3 years. Isabella had been another, both of them isolated by his fear. The idea came to him fully formed, Audacious and possibly insane. Two broken families, both missing essential pieces. The mathematics were perfect. He opened his laptop and started drafting documents, legal papers, financial projections, a proposal that would solve both their problems. Around midnight, Isabella appeared in his doorway, holding her stuffed rabbit. "Can't sleep, Daddy. Just working. Sweetheart. Bad dream. I dreamed about choking again. But the lady saved me, just like real." George held out his arm and she climbed onto his lap. Too big for it, really. But he didn't care. "Do you miss having a mom?" he asked quietly. Isabella was silent for a long moment. "Sometimes I miss Mommy, but I also just miss having a mom. Does that make sense?" "Yeah, it does." The waitress lady was nice. She smelled like cookies. George looked at the documents on his screen. The proposal that would either solve everything or end in spectacular failure. His hands were steadier than they'd been in 3 years. "What if we stayed here for a while?" he asked. "Would you like that?" Isabella looked up at him with Eleanor's eyes. "Could we see the lady again?" Maybe we could see her a lot." He booked a return flight to Montana for the following week. Point of no return. His fingers hovered over the send button on an email to his assistant, requesting she prepare the documents. One separate flame, he thought, looking at the city lights. Or two flames together, making something stronger. He pressed send. George knocked on Carrie's door on a Saturday afternoon with a leather folder under his arm. The house was small, white paint peeling, but the porch was swept clean. A child's bicycle leaned against the railing. Carrie opened the door in jeans and a sweater. Flour on her hands. "Mr. Hartwell, I wanted to talk to you about something. It'll only take a few minutes." She let him in, clearly confused. The living room was cramped but tidy. 3 kids sat at a table doing homework, a teenage boy who looked up with immediate suspicion, a younger girl with headphones on, a small boy with a pencil in his mouth. "Guys, this is Mr. Hartwell. His daughter is the one who choked at the restaurant. Can you give us a few minutes?" The kids disappeared toward bedrooms. The teenage boy, Jake, George remembered, shot him a look of pure distrust before leaving. Carrie sat on the edge of the worn couch. George took the armchair and opened his folder. "I've given this a lot of thought," he began. "I want to help you. Not with money. Not with a job. Something bigger." He laid out the documents, legal papers, financial statements, a proposal that he'd spent a week perfecting with his lawyers. "I want to adopt your siblings," George said. "All 3 of them. They'd take my name. I'd provide full financial support, education, everything they need. You could finish college if you wanted. The family stays together. The social services problem goes away." Carrie stared at the papers like they were written in a foreign language. "You want to..." She looked up at him. "You want to adopt Jake, Riley, and Tommy. Yes, I have the resources. I've been approved for adoption before Eleanor and I were in the process when she got sick. The paperwork could move quickly." "And what about me?" "You'd be free to do whatever you wanted. Finish your degree, travel. I'd make sure you're financially secure. You wouldn't have to work 3 jobs anymore." Carrie's face had gone very still. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but shaking. "You think you can buy my family? No, I'm offering to help. Buy us like you buy hotels." She stood up. "We're not properties to acquire, Mr. Hartwell. We're not assets. We're people." "I didn't mean it like that." How did you mean it?" Her hands had curled into fists. "You think you can swoop in with your money and your lawyers and just take my family, change their names? Turn them into something else. They'd still be your family. We stay together as Mitchells or not at all." Tears shone in her eyes but didn't fall. "We're not for sale. Not for any amount of money. Not ever. Please leave." George gathered his papers with numb fingers. "I was trying to help." You were trying to fix a problem. We're not a problem. We're a family. The door closed behind him with quiet finality. George sat in his rental car for a long time, watching shadows move behind the thin curtains. He saw Carrie hug her brothers and sister, saw them gather around her. Protective. He'd miscalculated completely, catastrophically, that night. Parked outside their house like some kind of stalker. He finally understood. Families couldn't be acquired. They couldn't be purchased or managed or restructured. They could only be built. Slowly. With trust and time and something he'd almost forgotten how to offer. Love. Isabella's question echoed in his mind. Why can't the pretty lady come with us? Daddy, maybe he'd been asking the wrong question. Not why she couldn't come with them, but why they couldn't stay with her. A different proposal began forming. More audacious than the first. More honest. More terrifying. He drove back to his hotel and didn't sleep. 3 days later, George knocked on Carrie's door at dusk. She opened it with her jaw set, ready to refuse him again. I made a terrible mistake, George said before she could speak. I'm here to apologize and to ask you something completely different. Carrie's hand stayed on the doorknob. I told you, not adoption. Marriage. Her mouth opened but no sound came out. George forged ahead, his carefully rehearsed speech evaporating. Isabella needs a mother. She asks for one constantly, and I don't know how to fill that void. Your siblings need a father. They need stability, someone who can provide what you can't do alone. We need each other. Both our families are broken. Maybe together we could be whole. You're insane. Probably. But hear me out. Wind stirred dead leaves across the porch. Carrie wrapped her arms around herself but didn't close the door. I'm not asking you to love me, George said. I'm asking you to consider a partnership. A real partnership. I need someone to help raise Isabella. You need someone to help keep your family together. We both need what the other has. You don't even know me. Then we take time. 6 months. Real courtship. Get to know each other. See if this could work. If at the end you say no, I'll respect that and leave you alone. But give us a chance. Give all of us a chance. Carrie looked through her screen door at her siblings. Jake hunched over homework. Riley watching TV with Tommy curled against her side. 3 kids who needed more than she could give them alone. This is crazy, she whispered. I know. You're asking me to marry someone I barely know. I'm asking you to get to know me, to see if we can build something together. And if we can't, if 6 months from now I realize this is a horrible idea, then we shake hands and part ways, no hard feelings. I'll even help you find better employment first. But Carrie, he met her eyes. I think we could help each other. I think we're both drowning, and maybe together we can float. She was quiet for so long he thought she'd say no. Then she spoke, barely audible. 6 months. But if this is manipulation, if you're playing us, I'm just a father who doesn't know how to help his daughter anymore. And you're a sister trying to keep a family together. Maybe we can help each other. Carrie's shoulders dropped. She looked exhausted beyond measure. What would 6 months look like? I rent a house here in town. We spend time together. Our families get to know each other. We date, like normal people. At the end, we decide together if this makes sense. And Isabella. We tell her we're friends getting to know each other. We don't promise her anything until we're sure. Carrie looked at him for a long moment, searching his face. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied something because she finally nodded. 6 months, but I'm doing this for them. She gestured toward her siblings. Not for me. George nodded, though he wondered if she was lying to herself. He'd seen the loneliness in her eyes, the weight she carried alone. I understand. When would we start? I have a house lined up. I can move in next week. Isabella can start at the local school. This is the craziest thing I've ever agreed to. Me too. Carrie almost smiled. Almost. I should tell my siblings. And I should tell Isabella. How about we both sleep on it? Make sure we haven't lost our minds. And talk tomorrow. Okay. George turned to leave, then stopped. Carrie, thank you for giving us a chance. Don't thank me yet. We might hate each other in a month, or we might not. He walked back to his car with something that felt almost like hope. Behind him, he heard the door close softly. Not slammed, just closed. Like an ending and a beginning at once. The first month was awkward. George rented a small house 3 blocks from Carrie's. Enrolled Isabella in the elementary school where Tommy was in 3rd grade. They established routine Sunday dinners that alternated between households. Supervised visits at the park. Weekly trips to the library. Jake hated him immediately. "You're trying to replace our dad," the teenager said during the 2nd Sunday dinner. His voice hard. "I'm not trying to replace anyone," George said carefully. "Your dad is irreplaceable. I'm just trying to help. We don't need your help." "Jake," Carrie warned. "He's some rich guy who thinks he can buy us enough." Carrie's voice was sharp. "Go to your room." Jake left, slamming the door. Riley and Tommy stared at their plates. Isabella looked close to tears. George wanted to leave, to spare everyone the tension. But Carrie met his eyes across the table and something passed between them. Stay. So he stayed. The town noticed. Of course they noticed. Small towns ran on gossip the way his hotels ran on reservations. He heard the whispers at the grocery store, saw the looks Carrie got at church. Gold digger, bought bride, scandal. His business partners called him crazy. His lawyers suggested a prenuptial agreement that would make a phone book look like a pamphlet. His assistant asked if he was having some kind of breakdown, but Isabella started smiling again. Really smiling. She came home from school talking about Tommy, about the game they played at recess, about how Riley taught her to braid hair. She asked when they could see Carrie again. Always. She called the Mitchell house the Loud House with something like longing. George found himself looking forward to Sunday dinners despite Jake's hostility. Found himself watching Carrie move through her kitchen, competent and calm, and thinking about Eleanor less and less. Not forgetting her. Just making room for someone new. In early December, Carrie taught Isabella to bake sugar cookies using her mother's recipe. George watched from the doorway. Unnoticed. Flour in his daughter's hair. Laughter. The concentration on Isabella's face as she cut out shapes. Joy he hadn't seen in 3 years. When they finished, Carrie looked up and caught him watching. Their eyes held. George felt something shift in his chest, something warm and frightening. That night, after he'd tucked Isabella in, Carrie walked with him to his car. "I forgot what happiness looked like on her," George said quietly. "Thank you. She's a sweet kid." They all are. Their hands were close on the car door, not touching, but close. Both of them aware of the space between. "Carrie, don't." She pulled back. "We have 4 more months. Let's not complicate this." But it was already complicated. George lay awake that night, knowing he was falling in love with her, with the way she was patient with Jake's anger, with how she let Riley be quiet, with the fierce protection in her eyes when she looked at her siblings, with her strength and her kindness and her refusal to be saved. This wasn't supposed to happen. They were supposed to be practical. Partners. Not this. Across town. Carrie couldn't sleep either. She'd caught herself laughing at George's joke about hotel management. Had noticed how gentle he was with Isabella. How he never raised his voice even when Jake was cruel. Had felt her heart skip when their hands almost touched. She'd promised herself she was doing this for her siblings. Only for them. But that was becoming a lie. The social worker visited in mid-December. Clipboard in hand. Questions sharp. She looked at everything with suspicious eyes. Carrie's 3 jobs, the worn furniture, Jake's anger issues at school. She made notes and said she'd return after the holidays. That night, George's business partner Tom called. They're questioning your judgment here. George, saying you're not focused. The board wants you back in Chicago. I can't leave right now. Y'all, why not what's so special about Montana? George looked at the photo on his nightstand. Isabella and the Mitchell kids at the park, all of them on the swings. Carrie pushing Tommy. He'd taken it 2 weeks ago. Everything, he said, and hung up. Tommy got sick 3 days before Christmas. High fever, labored breathing. Carrie took him to the emergency room at midnight. Pneumonia. The doctor said they'd need to admit him. George found out from Isabella, who'd heard it from Riley at school. He drove straight to the hospital. Carrie was in Tommy's room, holding her brother's small hand, her face gray with exhaustion and fear. She looked up when George entered, and something defensive closed in her expression. You didn't have to come. I wanted to. How is he? They're giving him antibiotics. The doctor says he'll be okay, but they want to keep him a few days. George pulled up a chair. Can I sit with you? This isn't your responsibility. Her voice cracked. This was the deal. 6 months to see if it works. But we're still separate families. You don't have to. I want to be here. Why? Because you shouldn't be alone. Carrie looked at Tommy's sleeping face. I'm always alone. That's how it works. I take care of them. I handle things. I don't get to fall apart. You don't have to fall apart. Just let me help. I can't. Tears finally spilled over. If I let you help, if I depend on you, and then you leave, I'm not leaving. Everyone leaves. My parents left. Jake's girlfriend left when things got hard. The people at church who promised to help, they all left eventually. Why would you be different? George moved closer, took her free hand. Because I need you too. Because Isabella needs you. Because we're all better together than we are apart. You don't know that. It's only been 2 months. I know I was dying inside before I met you. I know Isabella laughs now. I know I haven't felt this alive since Eleanor died. That's enough to make me stay. Carrie was crying now, trying to hide it, exhausted beyond measure. George pulled her against his shoulder and let her. They sat like that while machines beeped and nurses passed in the hallway and Tommy slept on, his breathing steadier. I'm scared, Carrie whispered, of losing him, of losing all of you, of needing you. I'm scared too, but maybe scared together is better than safe and alone. Morning came gray through the window. Carrie had fallen asleep in the chair, her head on George's shoulder. He'd stayed awake all night, listening to Tommy breathe, feeling Carrie's warmth against him, understanding that he'd already crossed the line from practical partnership to something deeper. At dawn, footsteps in the hallway. Jake appeared in the doorway, Riley behind him. The teenager looked at his sister asleep on George's shoulder, and something in his hard expression cracked. How is he? Jake asked quietly. Better. The fever broke an hour ago. Jake studied George for a long moment. You stayed all night. Yeah. Why? Because she needed someone. Because that's what family does. Something shifted in Jake's face. Not acceptance. Not yet. But the beginning of it. The teenager nodded once and went to his brother's bedside. When Carrie woke, her siblings were there. George brought coffee from the cafeteria. They waited together for the doctor's rounds, for confirmation that Tommy would recover. A temporary family in a hospital room, bound by crisis and something that felt almost like hope. That afternoon, George's phone buzzed with text messages. Isabella and Carrie's siblings, conspiring. Jake had texted, "She needs you. Stop being stupid." Isabella had sent Daddy. "Mommy would want you to be happy." Carrie makes you smile. She makes me smile too. George showed Carrie the messages. She laughed. Exhausted and grateful and something else. something that looked like surrender. "They're smarter than us," she said. "Usually are." "George," she took his hand. "I lied before. I'm not doing this just for them. I'm doing it for me too. Because She couldn't finish. "I know. Me too." They sat in that truth for a moment, scared and hopeful. Two people who'd been alone too long, finally brave enough to reach for something more. Tommy came home 2 days after Christmas. By then, the 6-month deadline was close enough to see. George and Carrie met alone one evening, walked along the frozen river while the sun set behind the mountains. Their breath made clouds in the cold air. Ice rimmed the riverbank. Winter had arrived in full, but George barely felt the cold. "We need to talk about what happens next." Carrie said, "I know." They walked in silence for a while. Then George stopped, turned to face her. "This started as a practical solution," he said, "a partnership to help both our families. But somewhere along the way, it became something else. I'm falling in love with you, Carrie. Not because you saved Isabella, not because you're good with children or because you'd be a perfect mother. I love who you are, your strength, your courage, the way you fight for the people you love. I want to marry you for real, not as a business arrangement." Carrie looked at him with something like wonder and fear mixed together. "I'm terrified," she admitted. "I lost my parents. I almost lost Tommy. Loving someone means risking that loss again. But I can't pretend anymore. I love you too. I love how you make Isabella laugh. I love how patient you've been with Jake. I love that you came to the hospital even when I pushed you away. Then marry me. Really marry me. What if we're making a mistake? Then we figure it out together. Isn't that better than being safe and alone?" Carrie reached up and touched his face. George kissed her, gentle and tentative and full of promise. Their first real kiss. Not practical or strategic, just two people who'd been lonely too long, finally brave enough to love again. They walked back as darkness fell, holding hands, making plans. That weekend, George met formally with Jake, Riley, and Tommy, nervous as he'd been in any boardroom. "I want to marry your sister," he told them. "But I need to know if that's okay with you. I can't replace your dad. I don't want to try. But I'd like to be someone who's there for you, who shows up, who helps. Is that all right?" Tommy said yes immediately. Riley nodded, shy and pleased. Jake was quiet for a long moment. "You stuck around when Tommy was sick." The teenager finally said, "You didn't have to. You didn't get anything out of it, but you showed up anyway. I'll keep showing up. That's what family does." "Yeah." Jake's voice was rough. "Okay, you can marry her. But if you hurt her, I won't, I promise." Carrie talked with Isabella that same evening. "I can't replace your mother, but I'd like to be someone who loves you and takes care of you. Would that be okay?" Isabella threw her arms around her. "I already love you. I asked Daddy for a mama, and he found you. You're perfect." "Not perfect, but I'll try my best." The practical arrangements followed. George transferred the house deed to Carrie's name so she'd never feel dependent. Set up education trusts for all 4 siblings. Started adoption proceedings for Jake, Riley, and Tommy, with all of them present. Making it clear they'd keep the Mitchell name if they wanted. They planned a simple ceremony at the town church for late January. Not some lavish society wedding, but something real. Something that honored both families they were bringing together. The night before the wedding, George sat with Isabella in her room. "Are you happy, sweetheart?" "So happy. Daddy, are you?" "Yeah, I really am." "Mommy would like Carrie. I think she's kind like Mommy was." George's throat tightened. "I think so too. And I think Mommy would want us to be happy." "I know she would." She told me so in my dream. George held his daughter close, grateful beyond words for this second chance at family. Christmas Eve, 3 months after the wedding. Snow fell softly outside the windows of their home. The house George had bought and Carrie had transformed into something warm. Lights on the tree, the smell of turkey roasting, laughter echoing from the living room. George stood in the kitchen doorway, watching. Isabella and Tommy decorated cookies at the table, more frosting on their faces than on the cookies. Riley was showing Jake something on her phone, both of them laughing. And in the corner, reading quietly in an armchair, was Marcus, a 12-year-old foster kid they'd invited for the holidays because he had nowhere else to go. 7 people, 1 family. Carrie moved past him with a tray of vegetables, bumped his shoulder affectionately. "You're in the way." "Sorry, just watching. It's chaos. It's perfect." She smiled and kissed his cheek before disappearing toward the dining room. George followed, helped her set the table. Their movements were synchronized now, like couples married for decades rather than months, at dinner. They sat together around the large table they'd bought specifically for this purpose. George at one end, Carrie at the other, children filling the space between. They held hands while Jake said grace. Jake, who 3 months ago had hated him, now leading prayer for their family. George looked down the length of the table, his daughter teaching Tommy a card trick, Riley and Marcus arguing cheerfully about which Christmas movie to watch after dinner, Jake loading his plate and actually smiling. His eyes met Carrie's. She was radiant with contentment, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with appearance and everything to do with happiness. He thought about Eleanor, thanked her silently for bringing him to that Montana restaurant last November, for the chain of events that led here. After dinner, the kids migrated to the living room. Christmas music played. Isabella was trying to teach everyone a dance she'd learned at school. Carrie and George did dishes together, their hips bumping companionably at the sink. Tom called earlier. George said, "Wants me to come to Chicago for a board meeting in February. Are you going? Only if you all come with me. Make it a family trip." Carrie handed him a plate to dry. "A family trip sounds nice. We could take the kids to the museums, show them the hotels. Riley would love the art museum. And Jake would pretend to be too cool for everything, but secretly enjoy it." They laughed together, comfortable in their shared knowledge of the children they were raising. Later, after the kids had gone to bed, George and Carrie stood on the porch. Snow was still falling, soft and steady. The town was quiet, just the distant sound of church bells ringing midnight mass. George wrapped his arms around her from behind. Carrie leaned back against his chest. "2 broken families," she murmured. "That's what you said. When you first proposed, I remember. 1 whole family now." She turned in his arms to face him. Turns out the math was perfect after all. The math was easy. The courage was hard. Worth it, though. Every single day. She kissed him, soft and sweet, a promise renewed. Behind them, light spilled from the windows of their home. Inside, their children slept safe and warm. Outside, snow covered everything in white, making the world new. They stood there together, 2 people who'd learned that salvation doesn't come from money or power, or even from fixing problems. It comes from having the courage to say, "We need each other," and mean it. From choosing to build something new from broken pieces. From understanding that sometimes the best families aren't born, but made. 1 brave choice at a time. Finally, they turned and walked back inside, closing the door on the winter night, closing the circle that had started a year ago with a frightened father and a competent waitress and a small flame flickering on a restaurant table. Inside, warmth waited. Inside, family waited. Inside was home. And that, George thought as he turned off the lights and followed his wife upstairs, was everything